Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Melanie Wooden, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this very special event organized by the Department of History and co-sponsored by the U of T Black Research Network. We are here to celebrate the launch of the book, Schooling the System, A History of Black Women Teachers by Professor Funké Aladejebi of the Department of History. The book explores the intersections of race, gender, and access in Canadian educational institutions. I am grateful to the faculty and students who are participating tonight and bringing their different perspectives to the conversation, and especially to Professor Aladejebi for sharing with us. Within our own university, we know we have work to do to progress equity, diversity, and inclusion for everyone in our community. It's so critical to have these discussions and to recognize the role of Black educators in moving us forward. Our moderator for tonight is Professor Melanie Newton of the Department of History. And in a few minutes, Professor Newton will introduce our panelists to kick off the roundtable discussion. But before we formally commence, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. At this time, I invite Mia McKee to offer words of thanksgiving.
Una wagahef, gagurihwaya egihre genike uwihre, una hesne, nawe, twet yagwahwita wadatna ina, agahwani et watigerra guatne genike digawadakye, una thwatitna na dutyadi hakanyutne ekina heratis, una yagwatigerra gwe, et wat de arutre hest, gatigerrad arake, twetje ne ekina heratis, twat ha rawadiye, gene, ha ufne, getna ere, ha uhrehiake. Disne ne kine heratis hane katigerra kwasna ne yegwat de arutre. Disne une ye kie hruye ha hitak digaya gegwestakye arye kine tiaskanyut yegwat tahite yegwat nene. Hane uchat digawadakya une ha hitu. Yawa, thank you for having me. My name is Mia McKee. I am a citizen of the Tuscarora Nation, member of the Turtle Clan, and also a student in the Department of History. The Skaruda words that I just shared come from my people, the Tuscarora Nation, a member nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and represent our responsibilities to our homelands and to each other. We share this Thanksgiving, and I gave an abridged one to honor the words coming this evening. We share this Thanksgiving before important matters as they help to bring our minds together and listen and think in responsible ways. They also help to remind us to be thankful to our human and more than human relatives in this place, even digitally. With that, I am honored to introduce Nakaniki Musisi, who is currently the acting chair in the Department of History. Her research and teaching interests focus on women, gender, and the state in African, pre-colonial, and colonial past, as well as the history of education in Africa. She has served on a number of important university committees, including the President's International Council for Engagement with Africa, the Provost Representative and Provincial assessor on various search committees and other divisions. Outside of the university, she has served on committees with organizations of scholarly and academic significance, such as the Volkswagen Stiftung Foundation, Germany, and Grand Challenges, Canada.
Thank you. The organizers of this event wish to acknowledge all the treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past. And those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. We extend thanks to the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism, CABR unit, which generously shared and permitted us to adopt the words of this acknowledgement. The CABR created this African ancestral acknowledgement in May 2018 as a voluntary recognition offered to support the City of Toronto's Black staff wishing to use it to acknowledge their ancestors of African descent who have been present and actively contributing to life on treaty lands and traditional indigenous territories since the early 1600s. I take this opportunity to introduce Professor Melanie Newton. Professor Melanie Newton is an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto, where she teaches Caribbean and Atlantic world history. She's the author of The Children of Africa in the Colonies, Free People of Color in Barbados, and Barbados in the Age of Emancipation. The book was published in 2008, as well as numerous articles on histories of slavery, gender, law, emancipation, and Indigenous Caribbean history. At the University of Toronto, she has served on various administrative roles, including Director of the Caribbean Studies Program. She will be beginning a 3-year term as an associate chair graduate of the Department of History in the fall 2022. Melanie.
Thank you so much, Professor Musisi. And hello, everyone. Happy Black History Month. It's my great pleasure to see you all here this evening as we come together to celebrate the beautiful and brilliant work of Funké Aladejebi, Assistant Professor of History here at the University of Toronto. I want to take the opportunity to just let everyone know that signed copies of her book, Schooling the System, A History of Black Women Teachers, published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2021, are available at a different booklist bookstore for a discounted price of $33 plus tax, thanks to the community reading warriors at a different booklist, Miguel San Vicente and Aita Sadu, who are the co-owners of the bookstore, which is on Bathurst Street. Please support a local Black-owned bookstore and order the book from their website or by calling the store. And we will also pop that information into the chat from time to time, just to jog your memory to purchase the book. It's amazing that you're all here, but if you want the full experience, please buy the book from a different book list. Also, I wanted to let you know that it's wonderful to see so many people here this evening. And if you know anyone who wants to join the event, but they forgot to register, they can still join. And we will also put the link into the chat that will allow people to register so that you can send to someone if they want to register to join the event while it's in progress. Now, I would just like to say a few words to introduce tonight's event and its significance. And then I will introduce the star of the evening, my colleague and friend, Dr. Funké Aladejebi. This is the second year that Black faculty members from the Department of History have collaborated with the Faculty of Arts and Science to host a public event in recognition of Black History Month. This year, we are pleased to have the sponsorship and support of the newly created Black Research Network, led by our colleague Beth Coleman, Associate Professor of Data and Cities at the University of Toronto and Director of the BRN. I want to acknowledge that our plans this year were impacted by some unprecedented challenges, including the censure that the Canadian Association of University Teachers voted to place against the University of Toronto for violations of academic freedom in the hiring case of Dr. Maria Azarova. One of the consequences of the university's choices in that affair, which led to the censure, which was not officially lifted until late 2021, was that we could not begin our organizing work earlier or ask Black community members and students to violate the terms of the censure by joining the committee. When our institution violates principles of academic freedom, it creates an existential crisis for us as Black educators, even when we are not the direct target. Respect for and adherence to principles of academic freedom, which include principles of racial and social justice and equality, are critical to the creation and maintenance of a work and learning environment in which Black educators, researchers, and students can thrive. We hope that the university's senior leadership, which remains overwhelmingly white and has not shown much evidence of learning a great deal from this central crisis, is present tonight. Perhaps this event is an ideal opportunity for all education administrators at all levels to reflect on these principles and to learn crucial lessons about what they mean from this conversation tonight about the role of Black women educators, a descriptor that fits most of the members of this organizing committee. I also want to acknowledge the successes, struggles, and tireless efforts of Black teachers and students in this province and in this country, present and not present at this event. This includes my own 2 teenagers and their Black teachers, who are amazing but too few in number, who continue to do the work described in this book in the face of educational institutions that still unforgivably struggle and too often fail to do the right thing by Black teachers, parents, and children. In this context, it is, I hope, a harbinger of change that Funké Aladejebi joined the Department of History as Assistant Professor of Black Canadian History in 2020. Dr. Aladejebi comes to us with a PhD in history from York University under the supervision of Dr. Michelle Johnson, my formidable colleague in the Black history of the Americas at York. Professor Aladejebi specializes in 20th century Black Canadian history, focusing on oral history, the history of education in Canada, Black Canadian women's history, Black internationalism, and transnationalism. Her articles on Black Canadian history and feminist pedagogies have appeared in Education Matters, Ontario History, and the Southern Journal of Canadian Studies. She is also currently co-editing with Dr. Michelle Johnson a collection of essays titled Unsettling the Great White North, African Canadian History, forthcoming with University of Toronto Press this year, which explores the histories of African Canadian, and African diasporic communities across chronological, regional, and thematic subjects. We are brought together today by her recently published book, Schooling the System, A History of Black Women Teachers, which explores the importance of Black Canadian women in sustaining their communities and preserving a distinct Black identity within restrictive gender and racial barriers. Dr. Aladejebi's time here at U of T has been almost entirely in the bizarre upside down of the COVID-19 pandemic, an experience for which none of us as researchers and teachers was fully prepared. Even in this context, her presence has already been transformative, particularly her advocacy for the establishment, finally, of a Black Canadian Studies certificate here at the university. This book and the institutional changes that she has already enabled reflect the fact that she is, in a very real sense, part of the story that she tells in her work. She's a shining example of a tradition at universities of higher education, of faculty and students who, in her own words describing Black women teachers, work within rigid Eurocentric systems and expectations to disrupt mainstream perceptions and envision Canadian Blackness as part of the nation. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Funké Aladejebi.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Melanie. And thank you so much to everyone who is here joining us in this conversation. I'm just going to prepare to share my screen with you all today. And in so many ways, this work is really thinking through broader social historical contexts that allow us to rethink and re-envision and potentially reimagine what it means, not only to be a Black educator in Canada, but to rethink the potential of what it means to facilitate and encourage students in a way that remains inclusive of their divergent knowledges and skill sets. And so I'm really honored and humbled to join you all today. Thank you so much to the Department of History, to the Black Research Network and the Faculty of Arts and Science for co-sponsoring this event and for, of course, featuring and highlighting the important arguments made in the book. So over the next couple of minutes, I am tasked with consolidating all of the really heavy arguments that I made in the book and try and give you all a Cole's notes of some of the information and things that I wanted you all to get from it. I opened, and in fact, the cover of the book is actually a photo from Counselor Judith Jackson with children who were enrolled in the Black Community Summer Program in 1976. And in a lot of ways, I think the image embodies much of the work of Black women educators who both functioned inside and outside of Canadian institutions to impart a knowledge set, but also a sense of support and community survival for young Black children, but also all Canadian children. And so at its core, Schooling the System seeks to examine the ways that Black women in Canada confronted and navigated socially constructed boundaries of racial alienation, limited institutional support, and inequality within Ontario's school systems. I argue that Black women teachers and their engagement with Ontario's education system was comprised of a set of difficult and often messy and complex processes, beginning with access to education and moving into their ability to get women into Teachers College and the constant questioning of their professional status, and of course, the material realities that shaped the choices that women had inside Ontario's school systems. I argue that Black women teachers worked to prove their legitimacy and dedication to the profession, but that they also understood the limitations within the school system itself. Black women's presence within these schooling institutions served to challenge the ways in which education was imparted, and also revealed a system that was ill-equipped to deal with its changing student population. This book largely features oral interviews, school board minutes, newspapers, yearbooks, and community records to say that Black women educators developed a sense of belonging in the professional sphere in ways that circumvented both the subtle and overt forms of racial and social exclusion that existed within Canadian school systems. In an effort to locate themselves within the Canadian national narrative, Black women educators navigated concepts of citizenship and created a new kind of belonging that was parallel to and at times intersected with concepts of Canadian statehood. By exploring Black women's lives more intimately, Schooling the System recognizes that Black women educators were complicated agents of social control and change. They worked within rigid Eurocentric curriculum and school systems, and also modified these systems wherever they saw fit, creating lasting interracial friendships and sometimes disrupting mainstream perceptions of Black student performance. And they also had the capacity to envision Canadian Blackness as part of broader society. And so in a lot of ways, their interventions sought to think through these complex ways. Perhaps one of the most important findings of Schooling the System, and that of many of the research of scholars of Black Canada, is to consider how anti-Black racism became embedded in Canadian institutions at the same time that conversations around multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion were happening. That is to say that notions of anti-Black racism became further entrenched because Canadians believed themselves to be above conversations of racism. And so you can have, for example, teachers and administrators who believe in inclusion and access on an ideological and even institutional level, yet they possessed common sense, everyday forms of racism and sexism that allowed them to view Black women teachers as less than qualified for their positions. It's why even years after anti-bias training in workplaces and elementary and secondary school settings, and even in higher learning institutions, we still see a limited reduction in biases, behavior, and in fact, institutional change. So my book helps to understand the messiness of these structures, but it also pinpoints to areas of consideration because much of the conversation around Canada has been to silo experiences or to make the problem of anti-Blackness so unclear that you are unable to see how something might be racist or anti-Black for that matter. Take, for example, in the educational policy that was created in 1850 under the Common School Act. This act put into law what was already practiced across 20th century Ontario, which permitted a group of 5 Black families to ask local trustees to establish a separate school. It's the same model for separate schools that we have today under our Roman Catholic school system. And while the act was intended to allow for freedom of choice and, of course, access to various communities, it also gave many racial separatists the ammunition they needed to enforce racial segregation. In various areas, local white community members used the act as a way to force Black students into separate institutions. These individuals often refused to allow Black pupils into public, then called common schools, and justified their objections by using the 1850 Act. It's at this inception that race-based separate schools flourished across areas in Ontario, including Colchester, where the last separate school system closed in 1965, over 10 years after the historic Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was won in 1954. And while there were unanticipated consequences as a result of Brown versus Board of Education, the unacknowledged foundations of racial prejudice in Canada ensured that Black educators could not gain access into public school systems until the middle of the 20th century. And so this leads me then to an important goal within schooling the system, and that is to understand how multiple processes of racism and sexism were happening and embedded in Canadian institutions. By the middle of the 20th century, there had been a series of teaching shortages that created openings for Black women to gain certification and training in the field of education. At the same time, Canada's immigration policy was changing. Rising immigrant and racialized student populations forced school administrators to seek out Black educators. And in many ways, Black teachers in Canadian schools were often considered to be cultural brokers or mediators that would act as go-betweens and connect the Black community, then at the time in certain centers, largely Caribbean, parents and community members with a predominantly white schooling system. As a result of these growing concerns, particularly about racial tensions within schools, larger urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, and Windsor, school boards and administrators actively sought out Black women teachers and their assumed expertise in dealing with the changing classroom dynamics in Ontario schools. At the same time as they were gaining increasing access within schools, Black Canadian educators responded to the Eurocentric curricula in ways that spoke to their multiple and fluid forms of Black resistance in Canada. Black women not only resisted racism within educational institutions, but they also sought to redefine and recreate their own understandings of identity and womanhood. Black women reinterpreted this curriculum to reflect their experiences as racial minorities, but also to represent Canada's diverse student populations, to consider the role and the knowledge that Black people brought. Schooling the system therefore argues that Black women's involvement as educators can be understood as this constant shift back and forth between community and institutional work. Conscious of their precarious positions within mainstream institutions, Black women strategically negotiated ideals of Black Canadian identity to serve both collective and their individual desires. Black women educators both utilized and rejected provincial curriculum mandates in order to gain some control over the services and teaching practices that would not only benefit their particular communities, but would also improve their professional careers. Offering an oppositional gaze towards inequalities within Canada's education system, Black women educators found ways to take control away from cultural gatekeepers who represented Canadian curriculum largely from a Eurocentric perspective. They used their authority and position within schools to better prepare Black pupils for the social and systemic oppression that they would face, while transforming the immediate social conditions in ways that created potential and enriched Black Canadian communities. And while it is difficult to often chart the kinds of interventions that have been made, I think what schooling the system does is to cautiously approach, or at least consider, that it wasn't just about placing Black women teachers as cultural mediators between the school and the community, but in fact, my research and the oral histories of Black women revealed broader notions of Black collective responsibility that sometimes challenged ideas of Black female selfhood and individuality, forcing some women teachers to remove themselves or reconstitute expectations that categorize them solely on the basis of their Blackness. Black women's rejection of this role then can be understood and interpreted as complicating the expectations of Blackness, both within Black communities and outside of it. And it largely sought to think about the way in which Black women were relegated into a singular homogenizing role that often positioned them as community nurturers within broader Canadian society. That is to say that their decisions attest to the difficult and complex truths of existing within mainstream institutions as a marginalized other, while trying to convey individual interpretations of education and equality. And in many ways, for the educators featured in this book, Black women have always both reflected individual value systems that complicate dominant discourses and promoted themselves as individuals who could make concrete decisions and choices about their lives. And another key feature in this book is to review the ways in which Black education programs created in the 1960s became the meeting ground where both moderate and radical Black philosophies met. As a growing sense of Black political activism developed in the 1960s, and most especially in centers like Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax, education became a critical place for reviewing the nature of Black organizing during this period. Black women teachers helped to create and participated in various forms of social activism, largely through education. And so Schooling the System also features educational initiatives such as the Black Education Project that developed and was created in 1969, the Thorncliffe Park School, which was created in 1970, and the Black People's Conference created in 1971. To argue that education became one of the primary ways in which Black Canadians, including many Black teachers, took political and at times radical action. By maintaining Pan-Africanist philosophies and utilizing at times Black power rhetoric, Black Canadian experiences, largely through these educational programs, sought to think through a growing sense of Black consciousness and to consider the way in which racial pride could be part of the way that education was imparted. Ultimately, Schooling the System quite pointedly argues that there was no singular way for interpreting Black women's experiences in Canadian school systems. Some Black women teachers described positive relationships and minimal experiences of racism throughout their teaching careers, while other educators found themselves benefiting on one-on-one encouragement from administrators and colleagues. Nevertheless, alongside these became valuable and satisfying experiences for Black women, but they were not exempt from forms of racism and gender-based discrimination in Canadian schools. More often than not, Black women teachers experience both subtle and overt forms of professional and social exclusion based on their race, gender, place of birth, and training. These women responded to these exclusionary practices by developing resistive and transformative pedagogies that often amalgamated cultural and community knowledges with Black feminist practice. In essence, Schooling the System demonstrates that the diverse experiences of Black women teachers had in Canada and Ontario schools were all legitimate and valid frameworks for considering the institutional and systemic barriers they face. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aladejebi. That was wonderful. Thank you for the rich overview of the key findings and interventions of Schooling the System. I want to invite members of the audience to use the Q&A function to send in their questions. You can do this at any time during the event. I also remind everyone that signed copies of Dr. Aladejebi's book are available from a different book list at a discounted price, and we will keep putting the link into the chat every so often so you don't have to scroll all the way back looking for it. We will now hear from each of our panelists, Professor Johnson, McCready, doctoral student Catherine Grant-Wata, and undergraduate student Sabrina McLennan, who are engaging with this wonderful book and the questions that it raises for all of us. I will introduce each of them in more detail before they speak, beginning now with my colleague, Professor W. Chris Johnson. W. Christopher Johnson is assistant professor in the Department of History and in the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. His teaching and writing explore Black feminist genealogies and transnational histories of gender and Black liberation. His research projects and courses examine transnational histories of gender. His current book project, Black Power for the Third World, traces the interwoven itineraries of Black revolutionaries who struggled for solidarity at the conjuncture of diasporas. Using post-war Black Britain as a point of departure, this study situates mobility, kinship networks, desire, and decolonial education projects as adhesives that knit together disparate but interconnected revolutionary movements across Africa, the Caribbean, North America, and the United Kingdom. Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Newton. Good evening, everyone. Yes, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Newton, Dr. Masisi, Dean Wooden, the Black History Month Committee for making this possible. It's my honor to be able to celebrate my colleague, Funké Aladejebi's brilliant book. Thank you so much for this gift. I hope it's okay, but my comments are addressed to you directly. I didn't really know how else to prepare them. Schooling the system is breathtaking in scope. It raises urgent questions about Canadian multiculturalism, the intersections of gender and racial violence for both teachers and students in Ontario schools, as well as the promise and perils of equity and diversity in our contemporary moment. Just as your research participants resisted forms of inclusion that pushed them to be hegemonic representations of the Black community, your book refuses universal portrayals of Black women educators as heroic, or perhaps I should say heroic, narratives of resistance to epistemic violence, institutional racism, and gender-based oppression in the workplace. Instead, embracing the messiness that you referred to earlier, the complexity and multiplicity of your participants' lives and labors. And I should also say a methodology that allowed you to have them speak and emote for themselves on the page. Schooling the system demonstrates that there's, quote, no singular way of interpreting Black women's experiences, end quote. Employed by the nation's factories of assimilation, institutions mandated to indoctrinate children into white settler notions of Canadian identity and citizenship, your educators were complicated agents of both social control and change, you write, and often, quote, stuck in spaces of contradiction, end quote. Schooling the system explores the omnidirectional strategies Black women educators engineered to survive within schools, contest the hegemony of Eurocentric curricula, and combat the state-sanctioned violence of schooling. This included the development of individual African-centered lesson plans, innovations of resistive and transformative pedagogies, institution building, community organizing, and the everyday sustenance of woman-centered networks and relationships. I'm fascinated by a lot of things in this book, but just for time, I'm particularly interested in how boundaries and borders operate in what you call a spatial analysis of the multiple positions Black educators occupied both within and outside, both within and against schools. As cultural mediators, Black women teachers blurred the lines, as you write, between professional occupation and community work. They infiltrated classrooms, staff rooms, school boards, and centered education as the bridge, the nexus, the meeting ground between disparate and divergent political ideologies and cantankerous and at times combative community organizations, including Black power and Black feminist formations. Their investments in education, you argue, resist any binary between professional and community life. As much as this book is a complex story of disconnection, as you put it, a collective biography of Black women educators as outsiders within, their labors to, quote, position histories of Canadian communities within the nation, I read schooling the system as mapping rich histories of crossing and connection that exceed any national narrative or border. For many of these educators, Canada, Ontario, and its schools were stops in longer itineraries. Some migrated from the Caribbean, others were trained and taught in England, and others, like Nicolette Archer, regularly commuted across the US-Canada border in order to teach, transferring knowledge and politics all along the way. Travel and mobility, you argue, were essential to their training as educators and their connections to others. Several understood Canadian racism through the prism of comparisons with their experiences in Britain and in the United States, and these migratory subjectivities became an adhesive that fostered networks of friendship and solidarity. Quote, whether they were born in Canada or the Caribbean, these teachers, you write, shared a training in white British values, ideals, and cultures through elementary schooling institutions. So while the US looms large here in Canadian narratives of innocence, given the attention to Britain, to Black mobilities, transnational labor flows, and what you call these blurred boundaries, I couldn't help but feel connections throughout this remarkable history and the history of schooling in the UK, both in the context of the brutal solidarities of global anti-Blackness and also the transformative diasporic solidarities against white supremacist knowledge and knowledge production. Alongside the streaming of Black students into lower educational opportunities, the heightened surveillance that you document, and the stern disciplinary actions against Black youth in Canada, we see concurrently emerging in Britain Black community mobilizations to combat the policing and abuse of Black children classified as educationally subnormal, as well as the eruption of Black youth and parent movements and Black supplementary schools. Through travel, migration, diasporic networks, and relationships, these community-based learning projects were connected to initiatives like the Black Education Project that you so vividly explore in Schooling the System. And like the Black Education Project, Thorncliffe Park School, and other grassroots educational initiatives, independent community-based learning posed a profound threat to the state. They were targeted by police surveillance and misinformation, de-radicalized and neutralized, you argue, by government funding. And there was one moment, where that point is made forcefully by the testimony of Agnes Caliste, funding as part of a broader process of co-optation, appeasement, pacification, and containment embedded in the Canadian Multicultural Project. Yet despite state interference, these teachers and their labors within and against schools pushed the Toronto School Board to address, at least superficially, discrimination and racism. Alongside student unions and student activists, they also pushed this university. Programs like U of T's Transitional Year Program incubated and emerged from the grassroots collective actions of students and teachers in the Black Education Project, and they've also been sustained by them. I'm reminded that 6 years ago, the Black Liberation Collective at U of T marshaled in the defense of a terminally embattled transitional year program and called for an end to the funding freeze as part of a longer list of demands to combat underrepresentation of Black students, administrators, faculty, and staff, increased funding and free tuition for Black and Indigenous students. School curricula, you write, played a crucial role in the creation and recreation of ideological hegemony, where Black Canadian knowledge was ignored, devalued, and unnurtured as a valid source of knowledge. Reading this, I couldn't help but reflect on the value, or perhaps lack thereof, of Black Canadian knowledge in Ontario public schools and on the very campus of U of T today. I'm reminded that prior to your appointment, there was no position in Black Canadian history at U of T, and courses on Black Canada hadn't been taught for over a decade. Meanwhile, students like mine could take any number of courses on the Black experience in the United States, and they routinely enter confessing that they had no previous exposure to Black Canadian history in elementary or secondary school. And this is reflective in part, of course, what is a major theme in your book, that is of insidious national comparisons and narratives of US exceptionalism that camouflage, in the words of teacher Tamara McGrant, better, more sophisticated practices and structures of Canadian racism, both inside and outside schools. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead. As your book teaches us, Black Studies has a long history outside and against the university, and outside and against schools. And Black study emerges out of long histories of transnational Black struggle, rather than from national, national or institutional benevolence. To close, among the many urgent questions that Schooling the System asks of us, you ask us to consider our own positions as educators, quote, in spaces of contradiction, as well as the perils of multiculturalism, co-optation, pacification, and band-aid approaches to racial inclusion and educational diversity in our present. So thank you again so much for this book.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for those amazing comments. So we will now hear from our second panelist, Dr. Lance T. McCready, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education at Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and Director of the Transitional Year Program at the University of Toronto, which, as Professor Johnson mentioned, has such an intimate connection with the subject matter in Dr. Aladejebi's book. His research explores education, health, and the well-being of Black children, youth, and adults in urban communities and schools. He is the author of Making Space for Diverse Masculinities, published by Peter Lang, and is principal investigator of the Black Student University Access Network and Restorative Justice African, Caribbean, Black Family Group Conferencing Project. He is the 2018 recipient of the Distinguished Research Scholar Award from the Ontario Education Research Symposium and 2017 recipient of the Ludwig and Estelle Just Memorial Human Rights Prize. Thank you so much, Dr. McCready.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be in dialogue with the other scholars on this panel and celebrate the schooling the system. It's made an incredible contribution. It's really caused me to think and rethink a lot of what I know and understand about Black teachers in North America, and as well as some about the context of Canadian education history. I really come at this from OISE. I'm sort of the lone faculty representative here. And while I don't currently do teacher education, I did teach for almost a decade in the initial teacher education program when it was at OISE. And we never had any sort of resource with the exception maybe of Annette's sort of book on Black teachers. We really didn't have a book like Schooling the System to really reframe Canadian education in our foundations of education courses. And so I want to say a little bit about that contribution, the contribution of Schooling the System to sort of teacher education, a little bit about history of Black teachers in North America, bring in some of my own biography. And then also, history, I think this is, Chris Johnson referred to this, of access. This is one of the mind-blowing things for me too, is to think like, what if we really understand sort of access as praxis and as a professional area is really grounded in sort of Black women's experience and work in Canadian education. Wow, that sort of really renders a lot of holes and gaps in the current literature on post-secondary access. So first, again, let me say that Schooling the System makes a huge contribution to the study of historical, philosophical, and political foundations of education scholarship and teacher education. It should be essential reading in initial teacher education and teacher certification, as it describes the history of inequality in Canadian education and how Black women educators fought against this. I think a lot of people may not understand that it's not a common practice in teacher education programs to really describe the history of inequality in the Canadian system. Instead, it's always described as sort of a very fair system with sort of a little blip with Indigenous schools and colonialism and residential schools, but it's not described as sort of from its birth sort of as an unfair system. And I think Schooling the System really sort of reframes that, and I think could help us gain a better understanding of that in our initial teacher education programs, specifically the foundations of education courses. I also want to talk a little bit about the literature on the history of Black teachers in the United States. I wrote a chapter, interestingly, on making space for Black queer teachers and the pedagogic possibilities for transformation in teacher education. And where in that chapter, a lot of what I talked about is the three major themes that I found in much of the literature on the historical accounts of Black teachers, that it focuses a lot on their experiences relative to segregation. It talks a lot about Black teacher identity and also cultural competence relative to Black students. There's a lot on culturally responsive teaching, sort of ethic of care, care work, other mothers. It also draws on the narratives of teachers and self-reflections of who they are in their practice, like schooling the system. For example, Michelle Foster, in her seminal work on Black teachers on teaching, shares the voices of 20 teachers in different stages of their career. And Foster focuses on Black teachers' commitment to educating Black students, which is a theme that runs through almost all the literature on Black teachers. Emily Vanessa Siddle-Walker's work looks at the historical underpinnings of community connections in the segregated South, again, a focus of the literature on Black teachers. In Their Highest Potential, that's the name of the book, Siddle-Walker focuses on the context of these connections and relates them to larger educational issues, such as the goal of the local communities to take care of their own. Adam Fairclough also unpacks the experiences of Black teachers in the segregated South, highlighting the larger context of Black schools being seen as inherently inferior. In A Class of Their Own, Fairclough examines the role of Black teachers as connectors between Black communities and white educators who acted as gatekeepers to resources. So I was really curious how schooling the system really gave me a much more sophisticated, I guess, political education on the work of Black women educators compared to when I say more sophisticated in the sense that it really brings in sort of the intersections of race, gender, class, citizenship status in a sort of another sort of political context, as Chris Johnson mentioned, a multiculturalism. And this was really a big education for me, and also gave me a sort of a new understanding of just thinking about Black teachers' impact in North America. I do, there's also these themes of cultural synchronization that I think that runs through some of the literature of Black teachers in the United States. And I think that since there's the acknowledgement of Black women teachers in schooling the system, it being really a diasporic group, I don't think it really can go down that same sort of road and narrative of talking about cultural synchronization, and instead has to talk about, I love the word that you use, navigating all of these kind of forms of social difference. So that's what I mean when I say that it was sort of a more sophisticated, I guess, understanding of the sort of the lives of Black teachers. And also, I'd actually, want to know more and hear more from Dr. Aladejebi about sort of the relationships with students and like how Black women educators sort of speak about that. There's a lot in that early literature about, in the literature in North America and United States, teacher education about sort of Black women educators having being cultural sync with their students. Do Black women educators in Canada feel the same way? Or I understood that work as much more sort of political in nature, but not necessarily as arising out of just cultural synchronization completely. So that was something I really learned and thought more about. Finally, I just want to assert how much I appreciate the way schooling the system informs the transitional year program, for which I am now director. Schooling the system really makes the link to the history of Black women educators to the transitional year program. Karen Braithwaite, who's one of the co-founders of TYP, is a radical Black woman educator who started TYP from a summer program in 1969. And so sort of reading about sort of Black women educators in the late 60s and early 70s really made me help me understand more of the work of Karen Braithwaite and how sort of radical and progressive and groundbreaking it was at that time. So TYP, which is arguably one of the oldest access programs for Black students in the country, owes its existence to Black women educators. That's powerful to me. And thus, post-secondary access as an area of study and professional practice, it could be argued, is originally Black feminist praxis. What if we understood access or post-secondary access as Black feminist praxis? What would it mean for us to understand it as always, or as at least historically grounded in the work of Black women educators? And so I want to end there and thank you so much and look forward to the conversation about this amazing work.
Thank you so much, Professor McCready. There's just so much to think about and to think about those connections that you've raised. It was spectacular. I now want to turn to Catherine Grant-Watto. Actually, I think we're going to switch over on the camera, who is a PhD student in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. And her dissertation focuses on the history of Jamaican culture and placemaking in Toronto, in Canada, and in Birmingham, England, between 1962 and 1981. That promises to be a really exciting dissertation. Catherine completed her MA at York University, an MA titled The Dark Side of the Canadian Dream, A History of Housing Discrimination in Toronto, 1961 to 1977, which definitely remains a topic that I think we're all very concerned with. And she completed that in August of 2020. Catherine writes poetry and collects reggae records in her free time. And it is so wonderful to have her in the doctoral program in history and here on this panel tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Newton. Good evening and happy Black History Month. Professor Aladejebi outlines a long history of Black women educators in Ontario, working as the pillars of their respective communities, social justice activists, and professionals committed to pushing forward more inclusive curriculums. My comments this evening on Professor Aladejebi's profound work, Schooling the System, will speak to two themes from her work that really resonated with me. Firstly, I am going to discuss the continuous threads connecting the history of Black women's educators, their activism and advocacy to this contemporary moment. Secondly, I would like to highlight Professor Aladejebi's methodology, her use of historical listening, and the centering of the oral her stories of Black women educators. Black Canadian history is often rendered insignificant, diminished, and often not addressed at all, or in passing, in high school curriculums and in many post-secondary institutions. In Schooling the System, we learn of a tradition of Black women educators campaigning for and implementing Black history into local curriculums. Recognizing the value of positive representation and the significance of learning about your cultural community's contribution to the nation, Black women educators push forward this agenda, educating their communities and their colleagues. Embracing multiple avenues of political action, these Black women educators founded supplementary schools and advocated for more inclusive curriculums in their respective school boards. For example, we learned in Schooling the System that Clara Tompkin, a Black woman educator from Windsor, Ontario, advocated for more materials representing accurately Black history and began to reconceptualize how the history of Black Canadians would be categorized in her school library. She worked to reconceptualize and recategorize Black history within Canadian history. Tompkin explained, John Brown came to Ingersoll, which was just outside of London, to try and recruit Black men to fight against slavery and the Harper's Ferry's raid, end quote. It is without a doubt because of the advocacy and groundwork of phenomenal women like Clara Tompkin that we can celebrate a burgeoning movement to include Black Canadian studies as a discipline in Canadian universities. The inaugural realization of the University of Toronto's Black Canadian Studies in 2021 attests to a long history of Black women educators pushing for a more inclusive curriculum. Growing up in Cambridge, Ontario, Black Canadian history was not taught to me in elementary school or high school. It was not until the third year of my undergraduate education that I took an African Canadian history course that was life-changing. I stand in the footsteps of Black women educators, and I would like to thank Professor Aladejebi for writing such an important history. I know that her work will inspire a new generation of scholars committed to recovering and illuminating diverse Black Canadian histories. Lastly, I would like to highlight Professor Aladejebi's style of historical listening and the significance of her methodology. I am writing a history that centers Black women's experiences, and I gleaned a lot from her work. Schooling the System encourages its readers to consider how Black women's choices are embodied and remembered. As such, the oral her stories featured in this book do not consider the Black women teachers as mere subjects of historical analysis, but rather views them as engaged knowledge producers who made deliberate and conscious choices about the choices they described during the interview process. The place of Black women's oral her stories within the writing of Black Canada not only addresses the fragmented and liminal representations of Blackness in the broader historical canon, but also offers a variety of methodological and political approaches for understanding the plurality of Black identities in Canada. That's taken from page 11. Between 2010 and 2012, Professor Aladejebi interviewed 26 Black female educators who taught in Southwestern Ontario from the 1940s to the 1980s. She conducted 1 to 2 semi-structured interviews with each Black Canadian educator. The interviews lasted between 1 to 4 hours. I admire her ability to amplify these women's voices, paying attention to the nuances and the details of her stories. These women speak for themselves and tell their stories in their own voices and on their own terms. For example, wherever possible, the oral history transcriptions try to reproduce oral meanings in writing to allude to the patterns and the rhythms of Black women's speech. The experiences of Black women educators are not monolithic, and these interviews speak to their varied experiences, complex and layered identities. This collection of oral her stories demonstrates how Black Canadian women educators defined themselves, remembered their professional lives, and pushed back against a long history of systemic anti-Black racism. Schooling the System is the history that we desperately need in this critical moment. We see the rise of white supremacy and hate symbols flying fearlessly out in the open. I would like to emphasize and echo Professor Aladejebi's final conclusion in her book. Quote, as an important precursor to our contemporary moment, this work acknowledges that until Canada's long history of anti-Black racism within its social institutions is fully acknowledged and addressed, there will continue to be challenges facing racialized students and educators within. Thank you for your vital contribution, Professor Aladejebi.
And thank you so much, Catherine, for those wonderful, wonderful words. Really, really appreciate the insights. I will now turn things over to our last panelist, last but certainly not least, Sabrina McLennan, who is a first-year undergraduate student at the University of Toronto. And we are so excited that she was able to join us today to share her perspective on this book. And she is intending on majoring in pharmacology and minoring in history and bioethics, which I am very impressed by. She is interested in the intersection of race and gender in world history, and in terms of understanding the sequence of events that has helped to construct our current reality. In her downtime, she enjoys watching psychological thrillers and thrifting.
Thank you, Professor Newton, for that introduction. Thank you, Professor Aladejebi, for having me here today. Yeah, as a student, reading Schooling the System was a very, it offered a very fresh perspective, to say the least, and understanding the dynamics between educators and the curriculum. Because, you know, as a student, I often think of my own place in the system. And it was very refreshing, again, to say the least, to think of the Black educators who came before me and their experiences in the Ontario system, as well as with education. Chapter 3 of Schooling the System opens with an interviewee named Rosalind Myers, describing her experience in education as a student and an educator. On page 81, she says, "I never had a role model. I was never taught by a Black teacher. My whole teaching career, never. I mean, my whole schooling, I was never taught by a Black person." Mrs. Myers' testimony dates from her experience in the 1970s. Yet the absence of Black educators is not outdated, as I've had the exact same one, and we're in 2022, so math. I can only speak for my own experience at the secondary level. I had one Black teacher for gym class, and prior to that in elementary, I didn't have any either. And my school was K-12. It was a very specific education system because it was technically not a part of the Ontario system. It was a French school, so it was the French system in Canada. But to say the least, the same trends of Black women occupying roles of nurturers was also observed since the school was K-12, and the only Black women who had semi-teacher positions were for the preschool students. So already there we can see a bunch of commonalities and parallels in our different systems around the world. And so that makes it that last semester, Professor Aladejebi was my first Black educator, funny enough, and echoing sentiments that's already been expressed by the other panelists. It was the first time I even got a glimpse of Black Canadian history. I didn't even know there was Black Canadian history. I thought it was pretty, there was some kind of slavery, and then now we're here. It wasn't, it was very gray. It was a very gray area. So suffice to say, Mrs. Myers' sentiment of never having been taught by a Black person, specifically in STEM or the social sciences, resonated. So yeah, I think the aspect reading Schooling the System that stood out the most to me on Black education in Canada was the curriculum and the Eurocentric models of learning in the curricula. Ms. Myers gives an additional testimony on page 86 that encapsulates this pretty well, so bear with me, I'm gonna read it. I was practice teaching with this one woman, and she made me teach a class on, I think it was an explorer in Africa. And the books were so old, they were probably my mother's books when she was in school. All I remember is, and it brings me to tears now, all I remember is that they described us all, the Blacks, as savages and, headhunter types, cannibalistics and rags or cloths, the whole stereotypical thing. And I wanted to cry because I kept telling her, do I have to teach it that way? Because I was mature enough to know that it was just a perception. But I thought, do I have to say it like that to the kids? Do I have to continue this myth? Because I know there were cities in Africa that were civilized with buildings and cars and those things. What good is it to have Black educators disseminating racist, harmful, and perverted history? That was my first thought after reading Mrs. Myers' anecdote / testimony. Of course, Black educators, we're on the same page, they're important, but if the school curriculum is the same, what does that leave us with? So in that sense, Schooling the System, reading it it achieved something unprecedented, I think, in that it gave a platform to Black women educators and their stories, through the oral histories. So really, I don't know, it's really crucial to putting into context our role and our position. But yeah, if, again, as a student, if I'm receiving a certain history and it is borderlining on a white propaganda-centered curriculum, having a Black mouthpiece tell me the history is no better than it coming out of a white mouth. And I do not use the term propaganda lightly. Any information that is biased or of a misleading nature to push a particular viewpoint is propaganda. And so that, mind you, we're not saying, at least in the curriculum today, it's not as brash as Africa monkeys, but you still have the same perversion that remains. So then, okay, so we're saying, and it's a really interesting conversation because I'm trying to find an answer, but I'm also realizing that there is not an answer that's clear. So if we're saying that, okay, we need more Black educators because representation is important, and on an interpersonal level, you're still able to make a difference and bring your own knowledge to the students, but then the curriculum is still the same. Okay, well, if we change one chapter in the curriculum, does that help? But then it's really the rot that it's at the core of the curriculum, because it's not just a matter of correcting a couple chapters in a history book, as I personally understand it. You know, even if they add the 2 chapters of Black history, that doesn't solve the structure. That doesn't solve the lay of the land. And so it's really interesting to think about. And again, Mrs. Myers's experience is reflective of the limitations of any educators seeking to teach outside the framework of the curriculum in academic institutions in Canada. Again, as I understand it personally, you know, again, till today, teachers are given a Eurocentric curriculum, of which all the knowledge production is white, as Professor has stated in her book, and this remains true. And so, I don't know, I don't have the answers. I don't think any of us have the answers, and I don't think that's what's being asked of us today in this panel, but I was just going down a thought tunnel. And so, yeah, great, really good work, Professor. And thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was fantastic. It was exactly what we were looking for. I really, really appreciate those insights, which I think, you know, my kids, if they were here, would be nodding absolutely in terms of what you said. So I really want to thank all the panelists, Dr. Johnson, Dr. McCready, Catherine Grant-Watta, and Sabrina McLennan for those rich insights and presentations, which highlight so many different aspects of this wonderful, wonderful book. I just want to remind the audience quickly that they can order Schooling the System from a different book list. Copies that are already pre-signed by Dr. Aladejebi are available for the low, low price of $33 plus tax. I also want to take this moment as we transition, as we sort of begin our process of transitioning to the Q&A, to just invite audience members to keep sending in their questions. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible. So I would like to take a moment to invite Dr. Aladejebi to respond to some of the issues that have been raised by our panelists before we take a couple of questions from 2 members of our panel who have read the book and prepared questions in advance, and then turn it over to questions from the audience. So Dr. Aladejebi, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to all of the panelists who took the time to read, provide feedback on the book. So many of your comments are resonating with me and helping me to think through the ways in which different disciplines perceive and read the book, but also the kinds of implementations and important interventions that I wanted the book to do, which is to really get us to think about these questions that you've all posed and these comments that you've posed around what do we do next? Are there full answers to these more complex understandings of a Eurocentric curriculum and a Eurocentric schooling model itself? So first, I wanted to address some of Professor Johnson's comments, really particularly around the idea of mobility, the notion of travel and mobility, and the way in which, if you think about a broader diasporic history that includes, for example, Britain and Britain's history of schooling and its experiences with persons of African descent, where we can see some of these parallels. So I think a thing that the book really seeks to do is to place Canada in a larger conversation of the African diaspora and indeed the Black Atlantic more broadly, to have a question about the way in which persons of African descent, Black people, have thought about education long before colonial models and systems of institutions of schooling were put into place. And as a result, if you think about the way that knowledge then gets moved or transferred across geographic space and boundaries, it really is thinking back to the original inceptions of education, community knowledge, expertise that happened and was deeply embedded in communities that sometimes were transmitted orally, but also sometimes transmitted through the embodiment of the kinds of practices that persons of African descent did. So really education becomes an extension of this longer trajectory and this longer practice of Black mobility, Black movement, but also this longer idea of Black connectivity and a longer Black intellectual tradition. And the work was trying to, and I think does that, is trying to connect the idea that this Black intellectual tradition that happened long before the institutions of schooling was created in Canada, and that those structures of the institution of schooling were deeply, deeply rooted in colonialism and of course enslavement itself, really didn't necessarily stop the way that education was imparted across geographic space and boundaries. So I think there's some of that there, but also the way that education, particularly from a British educational model, did not always service Black educators in the Canadian context. So the book, for example, talks about Black educators who were trained under British education models in the Caribbean, and of course, British education models in the UK. And yet those things are not transferred over as knowledge and expertise in the Canadian context. And it's because of those intersections of race and gender. And in a lot of ways, the schooling the system seeks to do that, is to point to the specificities of the way that racism becomes part of Canada's schooling system in these subtle but also very overt ways, that the same expectations that were made of educators, white educators who were coming from the UK, were not the same for Black women. And so part of this is to have a conversation of the way that mobility happens, but also that as a result of those limitations and those restrictions comes these broader practices of mobilization, comes these broader practices of community-based learning that never went away, that were actually deeply embedded into the community practice and education more profoundly. So that leads me to then, Lance's comments, Professor McGreedy's comments, particularly about post-secondary access as being constructed through Black feminist practice, and it absolutely was. The main crux of this work is to think through specifically the ways that Black feminist thought, Black feminist practice became part of the structures of education at its root and at its core, that there were so many ways that the intersections of gender and race and class, citizenship, language, accents, all became part of the way that Black women then made revisions to, sought openings for educational initiatives that both sometimes could have been supported by, but sometimes, and more often than not, were not supported by these institutions. And so it is so important to think about the transitional year program. And in a lot of ways, I talk about this as a continuum of Black activism in Canada, right? To say very concretely that all of these were broader systems that continued across time and space, really as a response to these exclusionary practices that did not see or envision Black students, that did not see or envision Black contributions as part of the Canadian curriculum. And then that moves me into Catherine and Sabrina's comments about the potential for works like historical listening, or to think about Black orality as an important way of getting us to get to the silences of the curriculum itself. That in so much of this work and this project, it was really trying to think through what happens when you have, for example, curriculum, or you have the archives more broadly, that does not talk about Black Canadian experiences at its intersections. So there would be categories, for example, around visible minorities and categories around gender, male and female teachers, but very rarely did those categories intersect. And so one of the ways in which to do that was to think through this practice of historical listening, think through the practice of oral history as a way and an extension of the traditions that persons of African descent did and took as a way of imparting knowledge and education. And I think the bigger question that particularly, Sabrina, you pose around what is the point, right, of having an educator or having educators teach in this model, this Eurocentric model, if the curriculum doesn't change. And I think that that's where schooling the system leaves many of its readers, is to ask the question about the responsibility cannot solely fall on the shoulders of Black educators to create these broader institutional changes, and that the schools and the institutions that we're talking about cannot simply respond, right, to these mechanisms and modalities that Black people are constantly advocating for, but must and always consider Black knowledge as a key and fundamental part of education, and in fact, inclusive education and anti-racist education. And so that's what the project is leaving. And so we'll see where the conversation goes from here. But thank you so much for your comments. I've written so many notes. So thank you all.
Thank you so much for the generous intellectual sharing. It's so wonderful. I would now like to invite my colleague, Professor Tamara Walker, and my friend and sort of longtime co-conspirator, Miguel San Vicente, from a different book list. And I just want to remind everyone that the book is available from a different book list and that you should continue engaging in the Q&A if you have questions that you'd like us to try to get to. So I'd like to invite Tamara Walker and Miguel San Vicente to pose questions to the entire panel or to specific panelists that they have prepared after their careful readings of the book. Thank you.
Hi, and congratulations, Dr. Aladejebi. I wanted to echo what so many of the other panelists have already said about tonight's presentation, but also the book itself. And I actually want to start with a comment, because one of the things I found really beautiful about the book is the way that you showcase what you call the radical hope of Black educators and even Black Canadian communities. And it's visible throughout the book, even in the face of what one of the educators that you spoke with describes as, and here I'm quoting from the book, resistance, sabotage, passive aggressive behavior, gossip, lack of cooperation, distrust, second guessing, insubordination, and things generally being made more difficult than they should be. And her statement and the hope that she and others continue to have for a better and more equitable educational future, I think really captures the essence of your book in a nutshell. So I just wanted to spotlight that and to point you and everyone else to the Q&A where people can see the many and deserved shout outs that you're getting for the book. And the question I have is both for you and for the other panelists, if folks are interested in answering it, and maybe you've already answered it a little bit, but I wonder if you could speak to what, if anything, this book asks of white and non-Black educators and communities in Canada beyond simply recognizing the experiences and the ongoing work of Black educators and Black families in Canada. Thank you.
I have a response, but I wasn't sure if other panelists wanted to speak. So I think the thing that the book asks non-Black educators and white educators more specifically, and I guess broader Canadian society, is actually to think about whose responsibility of anti-racist education is. And ultimately, it says that the responsibility is not on Black educators to do all of that work and labor, but rather a collective sense of the desire to create projects of education where everyone can learn from. So because so much of the schooling the system seeks to talk about the kinds of knowledge set, the kinds of expertise, the level of professionalism that was part of Black women's teaching practice, it also says that this philosophy, this notion can actually be embodied and taken up by multiple groups of people, right? That if everyone was deeply invested in anti-racist education as they are in, I don't know, teaching mathematics, as they are in teaching science, as they are in teaching, Huckleberry Finn in English class, that maybe the conversation would be different, right? That maybe there needs to be less reactionary approaches to the way in which education and anti-racist education is thought about, and actually a real rupture or at least a reconfiguring of education systems to include Afrocentric knowledge, to include the knowledge set and expertise of Africans. So it's asking to spread the wealth, right? To spread the labor of anti-racism and anti-racist education more adequately to the people who actually have power to create those changes. That I think that's the ultimate responsibility of the work, is to do that project and to absolve or at least release some of that responsibility as being solely shared on the shoulders of Black teachers and Black community members who constantly have to be the ones to advocate for change.
Thank you so much for that answer. Would any other panelists like to weigh in?
Well, only in response to that, I'm wondering but could non-Black education folk do the work in the way that Black women have done it? I mean, that's always the paradoxical thing, I think, is that you kind of want to share the work, but the work is not, shouldn't all fall on the shoulders. But on the other hand, maybe that's why I'm like, maybe we need to just reframe a lot of the way what we study, how we study, kind of through, as another thing that folks can do, that non-Black educators, white education do, is to let's switch our frameworks. That sort of provides a deeper acknowledgement of the work of Black women educators, and also sort of changes the nature of the work, like, right, of what it is that we're doing. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a tough question. It really is. Does anyone else want to weigh in before we hear from Miguel on this question that was posed by Dr.
I know
Walker?
Dr. Aladejebi had
Go for it.
answer.
Go for it.
Go for it.
You're the star of the hour, so go for it.
I couldn't tell if you could see that I was, okay, so to answer your question, it's to say, so the fundamental tenets of Black feminist practice can be practiced by everyone, right? This notion of providing an ethics of care, understanding community knowledge as being fundamentally important to education systems. So this notion of separating, right, education and community, of expecting that the humanity, the recognition of the humanity of Black students should fall only on Black community members is something that is a problem, right? So that's what I'm getting to, that there are parts of the way that Black educators do teaching that can't be recreated, right? Because it is a visceral understanding of how they live and see the world, how they've encountered education systems. And yet there are specific ethical practices, value sets that can be practiced by anyone, right? And so part of it is to think about those things as being your responsibility as well, right? As being part of the things that we should be teaching in teacher education programs, as part of the things that we just should be teaching in general in our community. And so part of that, so there's some things that just can't be embodied by anyone else but Black educators because of the things that they are doing and because of their encounters with education systems. But the book is also trying to say there are value sets in much the same ways that you would think about Afrocentric learning models, right? That there are certain kind of tenets in Afrocentric learning models that can be adopted into any education system, because at its core is an understanding of a connectivity, of a collective understanding of how we both learn, how we all learn. And so those things can be taken, I think, those things can be used, those things can be practiced, those things can be taught. They're just not valued in the same way. So your comments about reimagining how we value that work and therefore it won't be the same kind of work is, I think, a really important way of thinking about where we can make those interventions to stop and maybe push back against what Sabrina was saying around, like, when does the curriculum actually ever change and how does it change if not for those kind of systems and reimagining who does the work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I would like to turn it over to Miguel San Vicente to pose a question to Dr. Aladejebi and to the panel.
Greetings, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Melanie Newton, for inviting me on the panel. We were very excited when this book came out, because one of the things that from our experience as bookstore owners, and we deal a lot with the school system here in Toronto, and they continually asking us for more Canadian material. It's one of the very noticeable gaps in the resources that are available to Canadian teachers and educators. And so every book that's written by Black educators or speak to the Black education system. Thank God for Dr. Carl James and of course Dr. George Day for their contributions. But every book that comes out that by a Black educator is so welcome. And I'm sure, and I promise you, Dr. Aladejebi, that we will be promoting this book vigorously in the school system among the different school boards that we deal with, because it's so important. I mean, it's important for also for the fact that we know that the education system is one of the fundamental structures that, along with the police force, that is so fundamental to Eurocentric thinking and white supremacy, so that it's so difficult to make changes within the school system. And I have a son and a daughter-in-law who are educators and who continue, and what you, the points you make in your book about the challenges that Black women teachers face, you know, resonates in the stories that they tell me. So, so we are very familiar with some of these challenges. And but just before I ask my question, I would like to recognize though, and to pay tribute and respect to someone who died recently, who wrote a book about Caribbean teachers, Caribbean Black teachers that came to Canada, and that was Eleanor Rodney, and from she taught for a long time, and highly respected educator in Hamilton, who wrote a book about Caribbean teachers that came to Toronto, and were very taught in the school system here. So, going on to the question I have is actually one that will help me in promoting the book. It is that it's actually in two parts. It's one that is there something during your research? Is there something that you were surprised about, that you learned from your research, that you were surprised about, or you were disappointed about, based on what your prior expectations? And secondly, what is the most important thing you want people to take away from reading this book? And those are the two related questions. They might have the same answer, but so that is it. And thanks everyone, and thank the panelists, also Dr. McCready and Dr. Johnson, for your contributions. Really appreciated it. I learned from everyone who spoke, I learned something from it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that question, Miguel. I don't know. There were so many things that surprised me about the book, but I think probably one of the strongest surprises that I had are the different kinds of philosophies that educators had based on time and place. So a lot of times I found that Caribbean educators who came in and were teaching in areas like Toronto and these urban centers in the late 70s and 80s had a different understanding and different kind of history with Canada's education system. And so the types of advocacy work, the kinds of resistive pedagogies that they implemented was very different from Canadian-born educators who also entered the teaching profession earlier on, right, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but also had a longer history with Canada's deeply embedded and Eurocentric curriculum that led to a different level of advocacy work. And so by the time we come into the late 70s, they meet in these really interesting ways. Sometimes they conflict, sometimes they build relationships and allyships together. And so the thing that surprised me the most, or I think what I found fascinating about these varying stories, is that there, as I've said in the beginning, there is no one way to understand the Black experience in Canada, but rather that there are these multiple trajectories. Sometimes they stand in parallel to one another, sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they remain incredibly distinctive. And so our education systems need to factor in this diversity and the multiplicity of Black experiences, because so far it has been to think about Blackness in this very uniform and really troubling sense. And so as a result, we don't get to the complexity of Black being, Black belonging. And this is what I think the interventions the book asks us to do. So the thing that I think is most important about it is to say very clearly that there is a diversity of Black experiences in Canada's education system. All of them are rich and important for understanding and gaining knowledge. And there doesn't need to be one uniform experience to make that package tidy for education systems, but rather to allow for them all to kind of bubble in their richness. And so that's what the project seeks to do. And I think schooling the systems also, its intervention says that if you do that, right, then you get to the crux of anti-racist education, and you do it well. That if you get to the multiplicity of understanding how people see themselves in relationship to education systems and the world, then you get to tackling what inclusive education actually looks like. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for that question. And thank you to the panelists for their answers to the questions from Professor Walker and from Miguel San Vicente. And now we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience for members of the panel. And our first question is actually from a colleague in the Department of History, who says, thank you to all of the panelists for illuminating and inspiring commentary, and especially to Dr. Aladejebi for what sounds like essential reading for all of us. So more props, right? I would love to hear more about your process of assembling an archive for such a challenging, capacious, and under-researched project. In particular, I'm curious to hear more about the visual archive. The photographs you shared with us were so striking in balancing the familiar, almost cliche, classroom scenes in perfect order with the unique, revolutionary, and path-breaking images of, for example, Black women educators and students taking up space in deeply segregated and structurally racist institutions. How do these photographs speak to the oral history you've conducted and vice versa? And feel free to discuss your other methods for researching the book and challenges that you encountered in the process.
Thank you so much for that question. This project, particularly from a methodological standpoint, was incredibly difficult. And I think, in fact, the scholars who do any work on Black Canada have to take this interdisciplinary approach to writing and researching and unearthing Black Canadian experiences, because there's been so much silencing in the archive. So trying to find specific numbers and statistical evidence and data on how many Black educators actually existed in school systems in the early 20th century was nearly impossible, because Ontario school systems, Canadian school systems did not collect race-based data until the late 70s. And when they do so, they categorize all racialized groups under this category of visible minorities. And so you don't actually know if under this category of visible minorities, how many Black educators existed. Conversely, in statistical evidence, they count how many, for example, educators were women, how many educators were men, but again, you don't get the racial dynamics of that. And so this project involved me going back into yearbooks and teacher training college books to actually begin to quantify and visibly identify educators who were Black. But it also involved much of the labor that already exists in smaller community archives who actually preserve their own histories and the knowledge of educators who were in the community. So the Buxton National Historical Site, for example, was a place rich in knowledge about the local educators, about educators who moved into broader public school systems or transitioned from one-room schoolhouses into broader education systems. And so those visual representations are really also rooted in the way in which Black Canadian community members sought to preserve their own histories, even as broader institutions like the National Archives or the provincial archives refused to do so or to categorize them in the same kinds of ways. So in a lot of instances, the methodology seems to take that. And it also, I use the photographs as a way to really combat this notion that I got very early on in the research and in the work that said, educators didn't come till the late 60s and late 70s. And I was saying that's impossible. There's a long-standing history and trajectory of Black educators who existed. Mary Ann Shadd Carey and Mary Bibb were examples of this early 19th century tradition of education. And so it was to try and find and dig up these things, but to also talk about their presence as being very much part of the schooling practice. So photographs allow for that space. But I also use the photographs to get us to think about the fact that even when Canada's education system did not structure inclusive processes and projects of education, schools with predominantly Black students also welcomed white, Indigenous, and other racialized groups into their education structures. And so the photographs help us to very clearly see the way in which predominantly Black institutions, one-room schoolhouses, had a longer and more inclusive understanding of their students, even before this becomes more institutionalized in public school settings. So that's to think about how those conversations are happening with themselves. And then it was around going, the methodology really thinks through how you build collective community relationships to be able to get stories and evidence and research. And so this was around having conversations and tea with my interviewees, and they would have a book, right, of their teaching certificate when they first immigrated, or a picture of some of the educators that they stood with when they were graduating. And so that was to have this conversation about that important symbiotic relationship that happens when we have a responsibility to have ethical representations of lived communities, and the way that that comes into the work and the way that it gets used by oral historians and the work of Black Canadian historians, I would say more broadly. So that was some of the methodology of oral history, speaking to the silences, the photographic images, as helping me to create a database so that I could better understand how many educators, right, existed in Canada during this period, where were they getting trained at, what was their certification. And so that allowed me to at least speak to the silences and the statistical evidence and the data that existed or didn't exist around the categories of Blackness more specifically, but there were also limitations to that. And I think some of the challenges are when you create a database that seeks to visibly identify, right, persons of African descent in photographic images and yearbooks, you also miss some of the nuances of how Blackness is constructed itself. What about the people who aren't racially inflected in the same kinds of ways, the people who don't come to picture days or don't attend, those kinds of events where they take photos at yearbooks? And so there are limitations to that kind of work. And also there are limitations to, but as with the archives that exist in National Archives, there are limitations to the written text and the way that people were categorized, counted, and thought of. So I tried to sit with both and to try and give a more, at least a balanced approach to how people thought of themselves. And the many photographs also exist, and they're the first thing you see in the book Schooling the System itself, is to really think through the fact that Black women, Black educators were here for a very long time, really teaching future leaders, future citizens. And so it's part of that response.
Thank you so much for that fulsome answer. And I want to acknowledge, before I take the next question, that behind the scenes of this Q&A are two of our colleagues, Tamara Walker, who asked a question previously, and Shauna Sweeney, who are quietly assembling questions and making sure that we have all the questions in a form so we can get through as many of the questions from the audience as possible. So I want to acknowledge their quiet labors in the background. So this next question is for Sabrina and other panelists who wish to answer. And this is from Catherine Bausch. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. So may I ask Sabrina a question? I can relate to your incredible observations because after 20 plus years of education, Professor Aladejebi was the first person to teach me about Black Canadian history. What does that mean to everyone who had the pleasure of taking her courses in terms of your understanding of history, education, your experience at U of T, etc.? And how can the book serve undergraduate student learning?
Thank you, Catherine, for the question. I think the book can definitely be integrated into, the undergraduate level, maybe not the whole book in the name of readings. I've already been victim to 80-page readings by the professor before. So in the name of not all those pages, maybe not the entire thing, but I think
would never.
I think it would definitely be good. As to what it meant for everyone who took her course, I mean, it wasn't just learning about, the Black experience historically in Canada. It was like so many things. We also learned about, the experience for a lot of Chinese migrants in BC. It was really understanding how, in the context of what the course was about, it was really about understanding how Canada came to be what it is in the nation building agenda. And so, yeah, like it was, of course, the knowing for the first time about Black history, because again, there was nothing that was given prior, was definitely insightful, but it was really understanding like the ground that we're standing on today, how it came to be. Like that was really like the groundbreaking part of it, from like the colonial agenda with like the interactions, I mean, the genocide or however you want to phrase it with the Indigenous communities in Canada, culturally and, tangibly, like murder. And so like it was understanding all of those dynamics that was kind of like the aha moment and why it was a good course. I think I'm veering off of what the question asked, but I want to emphasize that it wasn't just solely about the Black experience. It was everything cumulatively to understand Canadian history that made it so impactful. So, you know, understanding like even the differences between the slavery in Canada versus the US, and how it operated differently, you know, with servitude. Oh my gosh, it's like remembering knowledge now, but yeah, so it's definitely different. I remember that. But no, it was, I don't know, it impacted, you know, like it's knowledge that I studied last semester, but I still kind of remember. So it lasted because I don't have an exam and I still remember it.
Excellent. Thank you. We would never assign 80-page readings. Oh, yes, we would. It's not true. I have done it. Guilty as charged. I know we're starting to run a little close to the wire, but I did want to ask Catherine, as the other student here, if you had any thoughts on that question quickly before we move to the next question from the audience.
Thank you. I had the privilege of having an independent reading course with Professor Aladejebi, and it was so nice for the first time to be able to speak about African Canadian feminisms, Black histories, and for a better lack of term, just geek out about Black Canadian history. It meant so much to be able to discuss these histories with someone who is so knowledgeable. And I had the privilege of taking African Canadian history in my undergrad, and it was a transformative experience that made me know that this is the sort of history that I wanted to continue to study. So these courses and the ability to have conversations about Black Canadian history with professors that teach the subject matter is critical and very, very important to the future of teaching Black Canadian history.
Thank you so much for your answers. Really, really appreciate that. So the next question is actually from Shauna Sweeney. For Professor Aladejebi, what happened with the Afrocentric school that opened the book? Is there hope for more Afrocentric schools to join Ontario school boards?
So the Afrocentric school that opened is still in operation, although it has received a series of funding challenges. And it's interesting because Sabrina and I had this conversation earlier about the way in which once a school has been constructed as Black or predominantly Black, it becomes underfunded, devalued. The structures in which people view education models become diminished as a result of these broader conversations. And that definitely holds true for the Afrocentric learning institution. And I also think even amidst these challenges, students still continue to thrive in these institutions. They still continue to see themselves, but the Afrocentric school system was not without its challenges, particularly around enrollment, and most especially around the kinds of funding that it's afforded, particularly if seeing where they could be housed, for example. It's basically a school within a school, and these challenges that come with the broader social perception of what it means to be educated in the Afrocentric school. So in a lot of ways, that's where it is, even though students have been incredibly successful as a result of the programming that's happening there. We're still awaiting reports that are being conducted to see how to track the trajectory of the progress and the success of the students who have attended the school for a number of years, but it continues to still struggle with enrollment. It continues to struggle with funding. And most recently at the height of the pandemic, it also struggled with online learning, right? That wasn't available to students who actually attended the institution. And so all of this is to say that amidst broader conversations and amidst the same challenges of, a Eurocentric curriculum that only semi includes conversations of Afrocentric education, we see that even when parents and community members advocate for these inclusive models, they're not embedded as something that can happen across the board, provincially, federally, and they're also not afforded funding, but they're also broader social sentiments that view the school as less than or not as critically engaging. So there are challenges, and I think, Lance, you have something to add to that as well.
Well, I didn't have anything to add. I just wanted to know your thoughts on just this focus on like Black teachers teaching Black students. And this, whether or not there's this special relationship there. It was a big, when I was going through grad school, I guess in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a big conversation in the history of Black education in the US about the good segregated school, that we needed to rethink sort of segregated schools as these bad spaces that were just under-resourced, and that there was also the special relationship that Black teachers had with their Black students really enabled the kind of education that was more transformative than it was in sort of the integrated school setting. And so, you know, I know that the trajectory of sort of the history of education, of Black education in Canada doesn't really linger on that question, but I also know from practice that our contemporary teachers have to address that all the time, because they're being put into that position almost as if, for instance, when in the moments when they had sort of the single-sex schools for that were for Black students, they would put the Black teachers in those single gender settings, right? And they had a range of experiences in those settings. It wasn't all kind of like, you know, rainbows and unicorns and beautiful pedagogy happening just because they're Black. So, but I wonder about for you, in sort of the history of Black education, to think about that question, or whether it's worth lingering on that, or thinking about that in the context of the Afrocentric school.
That's such a good question. And honestly, in the book, I kind of leave it in limbo as well. Because the educators in the book also reflect these things, that they really struggled with being forced to or being expected to be the sole cultural mediators, to be the sole leaders for understanding and teaching and imparting, you know, Black expertise onto Black students. And yet there also was this moment by which they're considered to be these warm demanders who can almost discipline Black students and have this cultural knowledge to be better able to understand, right, the Black experience. And in response to that, Black educators really resented the fact that the expectation fell solely on them to create systemic change, right? That it really is part of the challenge of Black educators need the resources, need the power and access to be able to, from the beginning, reconstruct and reconfigure what education looks like. Otherwise, it just becomes ineffective, right? Or it becomes challenging for them, and they're doing it in spite of, not because of the roles that they've been pushed into. So for me, the book kind of stays in this in between. And I actually think both need to happen at the same time, right? That there needs to be Black educators who are able to have the freedom to think about the complex experiences that Black students go to and go through to be able to help with the teaching practice. But I don't think that that practice needs to happen only with them. I think that there's work to be done from a systemic level where administrators need to create these models, need to create more inclusive learning. Educators need to have more training on cultural competency, on anti-racist, anti-Black racism more broadly. So I think this desire to have only one way to teach Black children is something that I kind of resist, and it's something that schooling the system resists. It really doesn't want, or in a lot of ways, I don't pick a side, right? I don't pick a side in the arguments because I'm not interested in sides. I'm interested in multiple things happening at once so that we see what education model works best for the students in your classroom, right? And so I think that that's been the complexity of the experience. I think for Afrocentric learning models, an Afrocentric school, the thing that I was most excited about are the ways in which this philosophy can therefore be implemented across Canada federally, right? But it becomes limited if it's only here and no one learns from what has worked, what hasn't worked, what are the effective approaches, how can we modify and change these things to better speak to our changing students and pupil population. And so that's been it. So that's where I stand. I don't pick a side. I want many things to be happening all at the same time, because I think the trajectory in the Canadian lens is to constantly say that this is the only way that education can happen. And I think that you can have that and then some, right? That it should constantly be an expansion of the way we teach, of the way we think about education. And I think that the women in schooling the system sought to do that, even as they were constantly being filed down into these narrow definitions of what it meant to be a Black teacher.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. And thank you for raising that, Lance. That was an excellent question. I think this last we'll see, it might be our last question from the audience. And it's from a graduate student in our department, Kobe Song Nichols. Thank you so much for this panel presentation. And I'm super excited to read the book. I have a few questions if there's time, but I think we'll try and skip to one of these questions. What was the most challenging or rewarding part of translating your oral histories and perspectives of your collaborators into an academic book? Relatedly, did you find the academic book format limiting or inspiring? If you could present these stories in another format, what would it be? Super interesting question.
Such a good question. Okay, so the biggest challenge of translating the stories was listening to myself, also agreeing with the comments, trying not to ask leading questions and trying to give as much space to like, okay, but what about this really important historical moment? Like, how did it affect you, while not telling them that it was an incredibly important historical moment, so that they could basically speak to themselves and speak to their own personal experiences. So the biggest challenge was having a research agenda and focus that I wanted, but then also very quickly learning that Black women educators wanted to take me where they wanted to take me, and I had to be okay with that practice, but also seeing myself as an educator in them and vice versa. And nobody talks about what happens when oral history is really transformative to what you do, and you see yourself. Like, I never knew I was going to be coming to the project in the ways that I did, and the oral histories helped me to see that very forcefully and helped me to see myself and understand myself. And so I think that was the biggest challenge, is in trying to maintain an objective approach, trying to give space to the complexity of Black women's stories, and not making them simply heroines of the story, but also making them complex human beings who were trying to respond to these broader systems. And it took time to analyze those things, and it was incredibly challenging. And I hope that I did their stories justice. If I could do another model, okay, yes, of course, absolutely. The discipline of history is rigid, and writing and thinking about and interpreting from an academic platform, I think made it incredibly challenging to do, but also so very rewarding, because it gave me some of the language to understand and quantify what I think some of the women were talking about. So in a lot of ways, I think that as a historian, I was able to see and do those things in a clearer way because of the discipline of history. But if you're someone who works in marginalized communities, it's highly likely that your historical approach is always interdisciplinary and always thinking about different mechanisms to understand the historical record. And so I think many historians are already doing this and thinking from this interdisciplinary approach, so it doesn't feel that strange or foreign. If I was going to do another one, I would really think through what it would be like to do kind of like video montages of the oral interviews, because one thing that you don't see and I don't analyze in the book are just how poised and well-dressed the educators were. They often commented about ensuring that even as they were doing the oral history process, the ways in which they presented themselves was a clear and important articulation of the oral history story too. That doesn't translate into written text. It's hard to be able to tell the audience or to tell the reader what it meant for a Black woman to see value in her story and her knowledge and her expertise and articulate that through the aesthetics of how she dressed or how she positioned herself in the chair. And I try to get through that in the historical listening elements of the work, but it by no means does it any justice. And so I think if I was going to do something differently, or if I was going to think about the project again, it would be to do this video, or at least get people to hear women's voices rather than me being the one to write and interpret their stories, but to actually have their voices in plain sight, so to speak. Thank you for that.
There are a lot of amazing questions. If we have time for one more, I'm going to just slip this one in. And I apologize, my cat is in the background losing his mind. You're going to hear mewing. Please just ignore. I'm going to ignore it. So this is from Jason Ellis. I'm interested in the generation of Black teachers that came after the teachers you look at in this book. There are some differences between them and the previous generation. Notably, they are Canadian-born, children of post-1966 immigrants. They are from many different places, not just the historically Black communities like Colchester, but the post-war suburbs like Scarborough. How did they learn from the generations of teachers you looked at? What are they doing in schools today? It seems like a wonderful question to take as our last question.
I was going to ask if Professor McCready wanted to answer this, given the teacher training, but I will say, I will say this. I think there are some continuities that exist in the historical record that move even into our contemporary context. So the idea that, for example, Black educators are constantly being thought of as cultural mediators, classroom managers, and I think that that thing continues to be a pervasive element of the way education happens. I also think from a historical lens, the Black educators that are working in Canadian schools now continue to still bridge the gap between community and schooling institutions, that boundary has not left, right? Like that messiness of moving back and forth between community and institution continues to be part of the way Black educators exist. But I also think that there are, a larger, or at least there's an increasing number of educators who are moving into school systems, who are now sharing resources, who are advocating for Black students in and outside of school systems, that I think becomes really important as part of it. One thing that my project doesn't get to is the growing movement of African, right, educators who are also moving in and coming into schooling systems. Like the project basically ends in the historical time period where we're starting to see a huge or larger number of educators who are moving in from different geographic spaces, particularly African countries, and the way that education is therefore thought through then. But I haven't been in the classroom in a long time to see the way in which Black educators are revisiting. So when I did start doing this work, where I was thinking about the postscript for this work, I talk about ONASB, the Ontario kind of Black educators, and the way in which they did a report that talked about the continuities of the discrimination that they still faced in education systems, regardless of these kind of newer models and tools. So I think that they learned a lot. I think they learned about resistance. I think they learned about how resistive pedagogy and practice could move forward. I think they also learned very quickly how to move through institutions into the higher sectors of power. But I do think that the lingering structures of anti-Black racism, the questioning of qualifications, the abdicating of responsibility onto the few Black educators that exist, this continues to remain part of the challenges that face Black educators in school systems today. So thank you for that. I hope I answered it.
Absolutely, you really did. It was, yeah, I think that was a perfect question. Thank you to Jason Ellis for that question, for the opportunity to hear that answer. And that does bring us to the end of our Q&A and to the end of our session, other than the closing remarks, which I will deliver for all of us. And so I really want to start by thanking PhD student Mia McKee for those beautiful words of Thanksgiving in Tuscarora and for opening our event in a good way. We really appreciated that you took the time to be here and to share in this event. It was a wonderful way to begin. I really want to thank the audience for staying, for those questions, for the engagement, and all the panelists, Professor Chris Johnson, Professor Lance McCready, a graduate student Catherine Grant-Wata, first year undergraduate student, Sabrina McLennan, for that really amazing presentation, and for the care, thoughtfulness, and inspiration of their engagements with this important book. Also want to thank Dean Melanie Wooden for her support of this event, and acting chair of the history department, Nakaniki Musisi, for reading the African ancestral acknowledgement and generally for being the person and the model that she is for all of her colleagues. My colleagues, Professor Musisi, Tamara Walker, Chris Johnson, Shauna Sweeney, and Funké Aladejebi, with whom I worked to organize this event tonight. Many thanks, it's so wonderful to have you as colleagues. Tamara Walker and Shauna Sweeney for curating questions from the audience behind the scenes. Professor Walker and Miguel San Vicente for their insightful questions. And of course, to Miguel and the folks at A Different Book List for organizing the signed copies of the book at a discounted price, which you can still get on the, if you find the poster online, you can still get to the bookstore's website, or you can order it off the bookstore's website, or give them a call, or walk in and get a copy of the book. I really am grateful to this year's intrepid FAS event coordinator, Sarah Kennedy, and the Black Research Network for its support of this event and its new and important role as a hub for Black researchers at U of T. Of course, to Funké Aladejebi for the book and the message in her research that brought us together tonight, and for the wisdom that she shared based on her experience of having researched this book. And finally, thanks to all the Black teachers without whom most of us would not be here now, and who remind us that every interaction, however small, is a chance to make a better world, and that every child is a potential future of as yet unimagined possibility. And on that note, I wish everyone a wonderful evening. I thank you all for being here. I wish you well for the coming year, and good night.